Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans and fantasy creatives everywhere, and welcome to Myth and Magic. And today I'm thinking about names and about how to name your protagonist. And I want to offer you 7 ways to come up with a memorable name for your character. In January, you're probably working on your first or perhaps your second edit of your NaNoWriMo project. If you're a busy author, we're always some part way through an edit. And sometimes when we're going through our stories again, we come across names and we think, could we have done better? And of course, it's especially important to have a very memorable name, a name which is nuanced for our principal character, our protagonist, and also I think for our principal antagonist. So that's why today I want to think about names and how to create names for your characters. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, says Juliet in Shakespeare's famous play Romeo and Juliet. But is that necessarily true? Just to say the word rose is to pucker one's lips. Try it yourself now. Try to say rose. Simply preparing to say the word is like preparing to kiss a lover. And could any other name for a rose be so rounded as the word rose, or so loaded with promise, or so budding? Could any other name overflow with such blossoming romance? What if a rose was actually called by botanists a stinkhorn or a bogbean? Would we feel the same way about calling our lover stinkhorn or bogbean? What if the iconic flower was actually named sneezeweed? How would we like to compare our lover with that word? But anyway, Shakespeare's tense romantic tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, is, as you'll know, about feuding families. In other words, it's about names. And so names are important. They're important in that drama, but they're important in all fiction. As authors, it's important, and in fact, it's vital that we get our characters' names right. So I'm asking you a question here to start with. How budding are the names that you are giving your characters? How timeless are the names of your principals? Are they as timeless as Romeo? Are they as timeless as Sherlock? Are they as timeless as Scrooge? If you're like me, and you're probably not, but if you are, you may sometimes get lost within a novel that you're reading because it has numerous characters. Sometimes the characters tend to be very similar, but it's even worse if they have similar names. And for me, this is especially true in soap operas or melodramas that I'm reading, or family dramas, or personal relationship stories, that kind of thing, where it's important for an author to make their characters seem authentic and realistic by giving them a, what you might call, banal real name. A real name such as John or Linda or Mike or Annie. But if there's lots of people with similar names, it starts getting confusing for somebody like me. I once attended a workshop for business leaders, and we were all sat in a circle and we were told to introduce ourselves. And then the tutors asked us to remember each other's names. Now, I'm horrible at remembering names. I'm positively useless at remembering names, especially new to people that I've just been introduced to. But some people are great at remembering names, but I'm not one of those. But the tutors came up with a helpful tip for name chumps like me. They said, this is their advice, play around in your mind and play a word association game when you're looking at them and thinking about them. They suggested that we should look thoughtfully at the person who gave the name and then make a conscious or perhaps unconscious link or connection or some kind of association in our own mind's eye that intersected with or it matched the person's given name. So, for example, if a person was called Lena, and we might notice her long legs, and so we remember her name through that reference, because Lena sounds a bit like lean, and that would indicate long legs. Or if the person was called Doug, we might notice his muscular arms, and we might consider that he developed them from digging in the garden, and so that's why we remember him to be Doug. Get it? Well, that's all very well in theory, although even now, thinking about it, does sound hard to do. But imagine if your classroom was full of people named Jay and Jason and Jaden and Jackie and Jack and Jamie and Josie, and they all looked identical and they all wore identical business suits, just like they did in my class, by the way. And you can imagine how hard it would be to play the word association game for somebody like me, who isn't very good with names. By the way, at this stage, you might comment that I'm not very good at remembering names because I'm very old. And you're right about me being very old. And you're also right that memory loss comes with aging. But I've always been this way with names. As far back as I can remember, I've not been very good with names. Although, and this has helped me when I was an investigator, I can recall a face over several years. I could probably recall a face over several decades. So the brainiacs, they actually came up with a term to describe my condition. It's called nominal aphasia, APHASIA. And this relates to the mechanisms used by people like me, but used by my brain to store and retrieve information, and how that information is invoked for my later use. Now, apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently a person's initial memory, it's called initial memory, only lasts for something like half a minute. So when you're sitting in the circle and you use your initial memory to learn that name. Now, if that new information is not processed properly and made available right away, then you won't transfer it into your short-term memory. And I think it's at that point that me and people like me with nominal aphasia, that's where we get stuck. But if, or once, the information is deposited into short-term memory, then it's linked to newly gained information or existing knowledge. And I think that's why our tutors were trying to get us to do the exercise. Otherwise, the information will disappear in the short term because of obsolescence or inactivity, which is why I think you're often frequently urged to use a stranger's name soon after you've met them. Anyway, apparently retrieving a name from memory, that's also called nominal recall, is even more complex than storing it into the brain in the first place. And although the process has been characterised as similar to remembering an image, and don't forget I can remember faces for many years, and the left hemisphere of the brain is involved, I'm pretty sure we can hold on to an image much longer than we can hold on to a set of random letters. So an idiot like me will still have to make a linkage between a face and a name that's been used. And that's why I'm not good at remembering names. And that's, of course, also why people say, I'm great with faces, but I'm bad with names. And sometimes I say, I'm bad with faces, but I'm good with names. Probably that's why our tutors recommended that we made a link or a connection or an association with another object to remember the name. But, as I've already warned you, real-life given names are often pretty arbitrary. Real-life names don't have any clues attached to them, or if they do, those clues might be damaging or unfair connections with perhaps real-life people from your past. So, for example, I was once bullied at school by a girl named Stella, so I tend to link any person named Stella with that old mistrusted version of the person with the same name, which is a bit unfair on any new Stellas that I meet in my life. And that's also called the halo and horn effect, by the way. Anyway, I think the bottom line is that we need to make an emotional or a personal connection with someone in order for our brain to register their existence and therefore our brain to register their name. I think this is the bottom line of it. And it's as simple as that. Fortunately, and now we get on to the authoring side of things, you're a fantasy author, so I'm guessing you don't need to create a down-to-earth character. And so therefore, you don't need, I don't think, to equip your out-of-the-world character with a run-of-the-mill name. But the concept of linking and connecting and word association, and you could say this is using cues, C-U-E-S, is something that I think you ought to think about when you're coming up with the names of your protagonist and your antagonist. Sometimes an appropriate and relevant name will help the author as much as it will help the reader to interpret and distinguish and to gauge a character. Oftentimes, fictional characters' names become quintessential to their actual character, so much so that the fictional name establishes an awareness of the type of character that he or she will become. So, for example, if I told you that I was writing a story and in my story there was a Scrooge type character, or a Grinch type character, or a Cinderella type character, or a Pinocchio type character, or a Pollyanna type character, or indeed a Romeo type character, you would know absolutely what I meant by that, even though I had used a proper noun rather than a regular noun to describe my fictional character. And that's why I say that names are important. Think of Bilbo and think of Frodo. What do those words mean to you? Have you noticed that those two names have within them a palpable sound? It's the sound of a ring. Bilbo wears his ring at the end. Frodo, however, is weighed down by two rings, one pervading his central being, while the other is at the end and is ready to be dislodged. Think of Skywalker. What does the name mean to you? You'll notice it's not Sky Glider and it's not Sky Blaster, is it? Why is that? Is it because the author will ask Luke to take baby steps to reach his destination? Is it because it's a long, hard struggle? And is it because Luke will have to slog his way through things before he gets to rule the sky? And think about Jane Eyre. What does the word heir mean to you? What does it sound like to you? Does it sound like inheritor? Does it sound like love affair? Does it sound like aware? The word is probably a play on heir, which is spelled H-E-I-R, which is defined as a person who has a legal right to property after somebody else's death. But how could that possibly apply to Jane in this story? Because she's an orphan. And so that mystery keeps us fascinated, doesn't it, as we travel with Jane across her storyland. And the best example, and it's my favourite character's name, is Pip, the protagonist and the narrator of Charles Dickens' magnificent novel Great Expectations. What does the word pip mean to you? Yes, it means pipsqueak. But it also means shoot. And it also means leapfrog, because we can say that someone has pipped somebody else to a post. But essentially, pip evokes in our minds thoughts about germination and about sprouting and about ripening. So Pip is an ideal name for a seedling character that has magnificent prospects. In other words, great expectations. So I thought I'd come up with 7 ways that you can create a name that will be useful and has useful cues for your reader. And so here they are. Here's the first one. Number 1, link the name to an icon. So in other words, link the name to an image or a picture in your mind's eye of something, or some other symbolic representation, for example, an emblem. Number 2, attach the name to an existing hero or anti-hero or luminary. Number 3, Associate the name to a totemic object. So what I mean by that is an entity or a spirit being or a divinity or an angel or a spirit animal or a protector animal. Number 4, tie the name to a sound. This is called echoic memory. Think about creating a word that phonetically mimics or resembles or suggests the sound that it describes. This is known as onomatopoeia. So for example, pip sounds a bit like a chirp that a grasshopper might make, but also a chirrup that a tiny bird might make. Number 5, link the name to a tactile sense, in other words, touch. So what you're trying to do here is attach the name to the feel of an item or the feel of something. Number 6, why not couple the name to the sense of smell or to an aroma? And number 7, and the final one, link the name to a task, and what I mean by that is use a verb, and a task that will be essential to your character's quests or to the assignments or commitments that you're going to give the character. So a great example, of course, is Skywalker, that we've already discussed. Also, Robin Hood is another one. He wears a hood to disguise himself, but it's also a hood because he's a hoodlum, and of course he goes robbing, doesn't he? None of these associations, by the way, need to be writ clear. I want to make that quite plain. In fact, it will be more cunning and more crafty and just plain resourceful if you manage to hide or camouflage your intentions. So I would recommend you try to be subliminal in your thinking, like Charlotte Bronte was when she spelled her character name Eyre with an E instead of an A or an H. Because then the name won't shout out at the reader. It will not be so self-explanatory or taken for granted, yet it will still appeal to the reader's subconscious mind and his or her innermost instincts. I don't know if you've ever thought about the rings in Frodo and Bilbo's names, but if you haven't, that's exactly what I mean by this. Make it subliminal. So experiment with spellings, experiment with rhymes too, experiment with word shapes, and try to experiment with rhythms. If all goes well, your next character could be the newest eponymous synonym to enter the English language. So good luck with that. Let me know how you get on. Keep me informed by tweet, and I'll see you again soon for the next instalment of Myth and Magic. See ya!